They called them the 6888. They were the only all-black, all-female battalion sent overseas during the war. They weren't sent there to pick up a rifle or fight on the front lines. Instead, they were handed a mission that the military's top brass had completely given up on.
I've never seen so much mail, trainloads of mail, that they could not get out because they didn't have anybody to do it.
By 1945, the war in Europe had a massive problem. 17 million pieces of mail were sitting undelivered. Because of the constant movement of troops across different countries, the army couldn't keep track of where everyone was. This resulted in huge warehouses in England getting packed to the ceiling with letters and packages. These buildings were miserable. They were unheated, dark, and filled with rats that were eating through the food and letters meant for the soldiers. To understand why this was such a disaster, you have to realize that in 1945, mail was the only connection to home. There was no internet, no long-distance calls, and no way to know if your family was still alive. When mail stopped arriving, soldiers began to suffer from severe depression and anxiety. The postal crisis wasn't just a logistical failure, it was a psychological one. General Eisenhower and the top brass realized that a soldier who felt forgotten was a soldier who couldn't win. They needed a miracle, and they turned to the Women's Army Corps. The unit was officially the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, which is how they got the nickname 6888. Led by Major Charity Adams, the first black woman to be a commissioned officer in the Women's Army Corps, 855 women were selected for the task. Their journey was dangerous from the start. On their way across the Atlantic, their ship was chased by a German U-boat, forcing them to take evasive maneuvers.
We were about 3/4 way over. The captain discovered a German submarine. So we had to turn and come back toward the United States, make a turn to the east, travel for several miles, and then head back to England.
When they finally landed in Birmingham, England in February 1945, they were shocked by what they saw.
We found bags of mail. A lot of them were rat infested, where people send food, pies and cakes. They were all vermin infested. It was a mess. It was awful. I mean, you looked around and you said, oh my God, what is this? But then you knew you had to get to work and start doing something.
The warehouses were blacked out, meaning they worked in near total darkness, and the air was thick with the smell of rotting food and damp paper.
And when we arrived, the Battle of the Bulge had created an enormous backlog of mail. Even all the mail which had gone to the continent for American GIs had been moved back to England because that the fighting was so severe, and at that point they didn't know which way the fighting was going to go.
Major Adams looked at the mountain of mail and gave her unit a motto: no mail, low morale. They didn't just sort mail, they engineered a massive organization system. They created a card index file for every single one of the 7 million personnel in the European theater to track their movements. They also had to solve puzzles, as thousands of letters were addressed vaguely to people like Buster, U.S. Army, or Junior, New York. The women used serial numbers and last known locations to hunt these men down.
I never saw so many Smiths and Jones. There's so many people with the same name. And the only way we could find out where to send the mail was by the difference in that serial number.
To get through the backlog, they worked 3 shifts a day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was so cold in the warehouses that they had to wear fur-lined flight suits just to stay warm while they worked. The Army gave them 6 months to clear the backlog in Birmingham, but they finished the job in just 90 days. Once England was cleared, they were sent to Rouen and then Paris to do it all over again. However, the 6888 wasn't just fighting the mail, they were fighting Jim Crow. In England, the military was still segregated, and while the local British civilians often welcomed them with open arms, their own military leadership was often hostile. The most famous moment of the mission occurred when a white brigadier general came to inspect the unit. He was unhappy that some of the women were at rest because it was their off shift, and he threatened to replace Major Adams with a whiter officer. Major Adams didn't flinch. She told him, "Over my dead body, sir." He threatened to court-martial her, but when he realized how indispensable her unit was, he dropped the charges and later praised their work. When the war ended and the 6,888th returned home in 1946, there was no victory parade. They were quietly disbanded at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and for decades, their contribution was largely ignored in history books. It wasn't until the 2000s that their story began to resurface. In 2018, a monument was dedicated to them at Fort Leavenworth, and finally, in March 2022, the battalion was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, which is the highest civilian honor in the United States. The 6,888 were the women who made sure the world stayed connected when it was falling apart. They didn't just deliver letters, they delivered the strength to keep fighting.